Okay, hopefully you can see the right one. Excellent.
That's wonderful. I'll
practice really does look perfect.
I'll hand over, Deborah.
Thank you. Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. So as John mentioned, my name is Deborah. I'm based in Germany at gesis, and my primary responsibility is to manage the secure data center. So today I'm going to be focusing on a couple of the approaches that we can take to providing remote access to confidential data. Now, just a little bit of background for those of you who are not so familiar with the social science world, because I know we have this wonderful mixed audience. I just wanted to give you a potted history in 2 seconds and also just confirm a couple of bits of terminology. So when I'm talking about confidential data, first of all, what I'm talking about is mostly data that comes from social surveys, although not exclusively. It can come from social media, administrative data, but it's essentially quantitative social science data. And this is data that we know has a risk, even if it's a small risk, of somebody in that survey being re-identified from the way we use and present these data. So this is data which, under data protection legislation, is generally considered to be personal data and requires, therefore, much stricter controls around its use and access. Now, historically, access to these data has only been available through a physical safe room, and you might hear other terms such as safe havens, trusted research environments. We have a shocking amount of jargon in this space, unfortunately. But this is a physical location, a physical room where a researcher has to go sit in the room so that they can access the data. Now, that's great because any sharing of these data that we can do is very valuable, but it's not particularly convenient unless you so happen to work at the institution where the safe room is located. So what we've seen in recent decades is this move towards remote access solutions, just to open up this access and make researchers' lives a lot easier. And I'm going to talk about 2 main models of this. Now, just a pre-warning that, again, different people use these terms to mean slightly different things. So I'll explain exactly what I mean with these 2 terms. So we have remote access and we have remote desktop. And I'll flag, when I talk about these, where you might hear different terminology used. So remote access is very simple. It's a very simple model at its heart. So we have data which is stored in a particular location, so location A, and it's accessed by somebody who is in a different location. That's the very simplistic view. And this is great. We've been doing this for very many years now. And what happens is the data remains at all times on the server at location A, so the data never moves. What happens is the researcher who sat in location B accesses those data through a secure encrypted internet connection. Now, in Germany, when we talk about remote access, generally what we are referring to is access through a researcher who is sat in another safe room. So if we think about location A being the secure data center here in Cologne, that researcher might be sat in our safe room location in Mannheim, or he might be sat in our connection point in the UK data service, which Beata mentioned very briefly earlier, and I'll talk about in just a second. So at no time is there any physical transfer of data. Now, in that location B, in that other safe room, the researcher sits in a very controlled environment. So a safe room is a locked room, access is strictly controlled. the researcher can't access anything else other than that access point. And what tends to happen is that there is a thin client there, which is a computer which is configured solely to connect to the data, the secure data facility server in location A. So there's no accessible storage capacity. It can't be booted up by anybody who doesn't have the correct credentials, the correct login credentials. So it's a very specific, has a very specific function. And it's very secure. We know this, we've been doing this for a long time, and we know that this works. And access is monitored through these secure technical connections and also through bilateral or sometimes unilateral agreements. And I'll talk about some of those agreements a little bit more. But that, in a nutshell, is what we mean by remote access. Now, other people will refer to this just as safe haven access, safe room access, many names, same thing. And this is a real step forward in many ways, because we can start to open up access to these data where perhaps we couldn't have done previously. And part of that willingness to open up through these systems is because we can retain the physical security features of a physical safe room. Now, Beata mentioned the work that's been done as part of the SHOCK project to open up access across international borders. And this is where this kind of approach has come in very handy. Now, what we tend to see is that data providers of sensitive data, confidential data, will place restrictions on access. And sometimes that will be that access is only permitted through a safe room, or that the data is not permitted to leave the country of origin, if you like. And having this kind of remote connection enables us to move beyond these restrictions without contravening them. It's also a step forward because it starts to reduce the financial and time burden on researchers who otherwise might have to travel quite far in order to access these safe rooms. And I just want to mention the example of the SHOCK project. Now, this was quite a lot of work to set up, and Beata was a big part of the team that developed these agreements and got them signed off. So we now have an agreement between GESIS and the UK Data Service, which allows us to have access. Through this and through the IDAM project, we now have 3 thin clients available. So one in the Secure Lab in Essex in the UK Data Service, and we have one each in the GESIS safe rooms in Cologne and Mannheim. And what that enables us to do is for researchers who are based in Germany, they can sit in our safe rooms here and access their projects using UK DS data, and vice versa. Now, trying to set this up in a pandemic was obviously, we faced a few challenges, but we got there. And we had our first live research visit in September of this year, which went really, really well, was very successful. And we're really happy about that. So we had 2 researchers who are based at the University of Oxford, travelled to Essex, to the UK Data Service to access GESIS data. There's a link at the bottom of the slide just to the full report on that if you want to learn a little bit more detail about how we went about setting that up and some of the challenges. But I want to just let the researchers have the final word on this. So they were happy to say that their visit to the data center went very smoothly. And they highlighted the fact that instead of having to travel to Germany, they could just pop up the road to Essex. And that was a huge, huge bonus for them. Contrary to popular belief, not everybody has particularly large research budgets. And factoring in international travel is really problematic, and it's a huge barrier for people. So we're really happy about this. Now, SHOC is not the only project that has looked at setting up these remote access connections, and I just want to mention briefly a couple of others. So in Germany, we have a new project which is just starting out called RDCnet. And this project aims to implement a network of these connections between different secure data facilities across Germany. So really exciting to see how that will play out, and the Secure Data Centre will be part of that project. In the UK, we have the SafePod network, which is not my area of expertise, but it's essentially setting up a number of SafePods across the UK, which will function as access points for these types of data as well. And again, if you want more detail, there's some good reports online. And the final one is the IDAM project, which has been mentioned before. But I just really like this map because it shows you the connections that already exist between different European countries. And Beata has worked on this project, so she can attest to the amount of effort and work that has gone into setting up these. So it's a huge, huge achievement, I think. So that's remote access, or access through safe rooms. The other type, the other model, is remote desktop access. Now, this is gets slightly confusing because we call it remote desktop access, but other places will just call it remote access. So again, this is where our jargon comes into play. Now, at its core, this is exactly the same arrangement. So we have a secure server in location A where the data sits, and we have a person in location B who logs in through a secure internet connection. So the basic premise is the same. The difference is in where location B is. So this time, that researcher is not sat in a physical safe room somewhere or a safe haven. He will be sat, for example, in their own institutional office. So me as a researcher, I could sit here in my office in Cologne and log in remotely. And this is great because one of the limitations still with remote access through safe havens is that there is still some traveling involved. There are a lot of projects opening up access points now, which is fantastic, but there are still relatively few of them. So this really marks, another leap forward. And I'm going to switch to talking more specifically about the Secure Data Centre here as an example. So at the moment, our primary access pathway is still our safe room. And we have these two remote access points in the UK and Mannheim. But actually, a lot of our visitors don't come from Germany. They actually come from across Europe and the US. We're very popular with Swiss researchers at the moment, which is great because Switzerland's not that far. But of course, we've just come out of 2 years of pandemic lockdowns, which from a research point of view has meant that we've had to close for 2 years. So we've had to rethink, and it's the positive that's come out of that is that it's pushed our drive towards moving to a remote desktop system forward. It's really helped us to make an argument for that system. But when we think about moving from physical safe room access to remote desktop systems, there are a number of things that we need to address. And I'm just going to talk through some of the key ones. And I'm going to hang all of that discussion on the 5 Safes framework, which Darren mentioned right at the start. Now, the 5 Safes framework is a very common way of thinking about how to set up safe remote access, both through safe rooms and remote desktop. It's quite widely used in social science settings. And it's great because actually the framework also quite neatly follows the life cycle of a secure data project, from application right through to publication of results. And in developing our remote desktop system here, we are drawing really heavily on the experiences and the successes of other services that use this framework, because we know it works and there's really no need for us to reinvent the wheel here. So I'm going to give a really brief overview of 4 of those safes, which are more directly connected to the role that I have. So the first one is to look at safe projects, and this is really where the researcher's journey starts. And this starts with the application process. Now, our primary tool here is data use agreements or licenses or contracts. Again, we have different terminology, but essentially this is an agreement between us as the data provider or the data service and the researcher who's going to be using the data. Now, data protection legislation allows access to personal data under certain exemptions for research purposes, but it's not a free-for-all. So we can think of this as being a legal gateway, which is specific to the person, project data, etc. So these legally binding formal agreements between the data service and the researcher set out who can access what data, for what purpose, and for how long. And here we assess whether the project is for a valid purpose. So there has to be a reason to do it, not just, doing something on a whim. There has to be a good statistical purpose. It has to be feasible. We have to know if they're using external data sources as well. We want to know about the methodology. So these data use agreements or contracts is where we collect all of this information. They also set out the terms and conditions so that the researcher knows very clearly what they can and can't do. And it's our first line of defense, if you like, in a security model, because it gives us a legal framework so that if a researcher acts in a way which potentially causes harm or causes a disclosure to occur, or acts in any way which is going to see them in breach of legislation, we have a framework through which we can take preventative action. So that's the first safe. The second one is to look at safe people. And primarily, we deal with this through researcher training. Now, we know that even very experienced researchers don't always understand fully the requirements for working with secure data. We know that because we simply don't get taught it. And if we have even very good research data management training, quite often it doesn't cover specific things like statistical disclosure, for example. Now, the good news is that there are existing training materials that are freely available, and I'll mention the SHOCK project again because that was part of the work we did, was to develop a set of training materials for this purpose. There are others. The Secure Data Access Professionals Network also has some training materials available. And what we see quite commonly in the UK at least is that part of the application process is a researcher undergoing mandatory training specifically around working with these kinds of data. Now, we don't really tend to have that here in Germany, and we don't have it in ESIS, but we will by the time the remote desktop system is in place. And just because, why stop at delivering your own training when you can, turn that into a bigger project? So with a number of partners across Germany, we're now looking at developing a federated training program for this very specific program in Germany. Totally early stages of the planning, But essentially, this is the kind of thing that it will include. So we'll have some core modules looking at the 5 safes, output statistical disclosure control, those sort of things. And then we'll have some service-specific modules, etc. And the idea is that a researcher will go through the training program and will come out the other end a safe researcher. Very, very similar to the UK Safe Researcher accreditation in the UK. Okay, so the next one, I'm going to skip safe data because that's not part of our role at the Secure Data Centre that's dealt with the wider archive. So I'm going to skip to safe setting. And here we tend to rely very much on technical and situational restrictions. So the working environment that a researcher accesses is a virtual desktop, and that is a completely sealed off desktop. So each researcher has their own unique login credentials, and they can only access the folders that are relevant to their project. So they can't see anybody else's projects. They can't see any data that they don't have access to. So this virtual desktop is a completely sealed environment. So they can't upload or download files in and out of that environment. Everything has to be done by the staff at the Secure Data Centre. There are other things such as an automatic timeout screen lock that pops up after inactivity, all these sort of things. And there are some additional things. So when we have visitors here in a safe room, we will do things like check their ID, so their ID card or their passports. We have full workstations, so we have privacy screens on each one. The room is locked. We do allow researchers out at the end of the day before anybody gets concerned, but that room is, the access to that room is strictly controlled. So there's only 2 of us staff members who can access, and we control who goes in and out. Personal items are not permitted, so researchers have to leave everything in a locker when they enter the room. Now, taking notes, this is something that differs. So we do allow researchers to write notes, but they have to be screened before they leave at the end of the day. Some additional ones when we think about remote desktop, because we will lose the ability to control some of those things when we don't have the researcher here in our building. So we want to bring in 2-factor authentication. So that will be the unique login credentials and a biometric measure, which will be, I can never remember the name of it, but researchers will have to type a passphrase, and it will measure, it will judge by the typing pressure, whether it's them or not. There's a name for it, and I can't think of it. You can set requirements as well for the workstation. So we know the researcher will be sat in their own office, but again, they can't just do anything. It has to be, for example, in a private office, so they can't sit in Starbucks and access the data with the world walking behind them. There has to be a fixed IP address, and access for that IP address is controlled by the firewall. And here, this is where our non-technical controls come in, like our training and our legal agreements.
Deborah, can I just give you the sort of the 1 minute to go kind of, I know we started a bit late, so apologies for that, but just move to rapidly. Wonderful, thank you. Yeah,
I'm pretty much there actually. So the final 5 safe is outputs. And we deal with this through statistical disclosure control. Now, essentially, an output, if anybody's not familiar with the term, is the analytical results that a researcher wants to publish. So this is the thing that's going to be seen by the wider public. Now, we know that statistically, there is a risk that somebody in the survey could be identified through those published results. The risk is minimal, we know that, but it's not 0. So the aim here is to minimize that risk. So what we term as a safe output is one that we're confident doesn't reveal any confidential information about someone. Now, we have this idea of the improvability of safety. So we can never say that a piece of output in combination with the whole world of data which is out there. But we have to demonstrate that we've taken all reasonable steps. And we do that through statistical disclosure control. And that's really very simple. It's a set of rules which we apply to outputs before they're released. And again, there's a lot of information out there. If anybody wants to have a look, in fact, I haven't put the link here, but SDAP have a fantastic SDC handbook, which covers all of this in wonderful, wonderful detail. And that's me. So I appreciate it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. So I don't know if we have time for questions or not, but we can always pick some of this up in the panel, I guess.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Deborah. I mean, that was a fantastic overview and grounding, I think, of the world in which certainly in the social sciences we work in. So thank you very much for that. If we can hold for any questions.